So almost to sum up what we're talking about, you often use quotes from Nietzsche and Wittgenstein. So Nietzsche's, our writing tools are working on our thoughts. You've got Wittgenstein's talking about how writing happens between his hand and the paper. It's just something, when he's writing, he's not really thinking about it, it just sort of happens. So what I'm interested in is what's going to happen as the means in which we create and disseminate knowledge and research and ideas, if it isn't just writing, if it isn't just the typewriter. Nietzsche's often thought of as the first mechanized philosopher, as he started with the typewriter. If it's moving on to these new forms of media, how's that going to change the way that we think, the way that we act as theorists and philosophers? If it's not the pen that the contemporary Wittgensteins are using, but it is a keyboard, or it is a smartphone, or it is a digital camera, what's that going to look like? What's that going to do with our sense of self, the way that we think, our subjectivities, the way that we connect to the world? So how do I see the self today? A lot of people talk about, if you like, what we have is like a networked individualism. That's something from Manuel Castells. So you've got all these individuals, and they're operating in individuals, but they're using the social networks, they're using the social media to form groups. Those groups were not going to be stable as they might have been previously in some sort of class formations, but they can rise up, they can get together in certain issues, they can flow and dissolve again, and so you've got this kind of networked individualism. I suppose what I'm interested in right now and what I'm working on right now is the way that hanging on to certain notions of the individual creates problems for us. So for me, it seems that we don't really understand these new media and how they're impinging on us, how they're shaping us, and if our only way to continue to understand them is to act as, if we don't want to be that a neoliberal subject that something like Twitter or Facebook is connecting, if we can only kind of counter that by being a very liberal subject and write some books about it, that seems to me that we get into this stage of almost melancholia. It's like we don't really know what's happening, we're very unhappy about it, but we can't change it. Because for me, at the bottom, that liberal subjectivity, neoliberal subjectivity, they're pretty much connected. Obviously there are differences between liberalism and neoliberalism, the difference within those two philosophies, and they're not coherent systems themselves, but they both come down to this notion of the individual with certain rights. Neoliberalism's putting much more emphasis on market forces, but it's precisely our problem to think other than those terms that leads us to we can't really understand this, we can't really get to grips with it. So everyone here is kind of really melancholic because we've just had the UK election and the result was quite surprising and shocking. None of this means that we can't have individual subjects, or we've talked about the author or individual writers. It's more about, if we go back to that notion of fluidity, we were talking around about piracy, it's more about where you kind of draw the boundaries, or someone like Karen Bagg would talk about it in cuts, Jacques Derrida would talk about it in making a decision. But can we make those, can we think of what we understand an individual or a subject to be, can we think of it as differently? Can we think of it as being much more connected both to other people? If I write something, it's the product of my peers, my teachers, my caregivers, my friends, my students, whoever's fed into that. But it's, as we talked about before, if you want to get into that materialist notion, it's the product of my kind of environment, which is itself, you could say, it's constantly in process, it's constantly fluid. But how do we take account of that rather than trying to continually repress it or exclude it and say, no, this is mine, these are the boundaries, this is all my work, it's no one else, I'm going to put a copyright notice on it, I'm going to commodify it, I'm going to fix it. So I've talked about new media being fluid. With the Living Book series, we talk about another way of understanding that as being in living, but we shouldn't flip back into saying that books are dead we have that notion of the dead trees. Books themselves are very much living. They obviously come from living things, trees. It's the kind of the bark. If I'm rendering correctly, the etymology of the word libra comes from a kind of a notion of life. But books themselves are fluid, are in process and changing. It's a slower process, if you like. Going back to your speed, so the change is not quite so obvious, but texts, books are born, they have a certain life, they start to degrade, people mess them around and they spill coffee on them and they rip them up or they bend the corners, they slowly, and then end up in landfill somewhere, or maybe they'll be recycled. They kind of go through that process, but neither are they you can't think of them as dead objects, as in they need an organic human body to live, if you like. I mean, they're books, they're designed to interact very well with the human body. So you need two hands to open them. Their pages match our two eyes. They only work in that system with the human body. So they're very much alive too. So Culture Machine is another of the projects that we run, and again this is very much a group project. I started it with Dave Boothroyd. Currently we're the executive editors, Dave Boothroyd and I, along with Joanna Zielinska, and that was an online open access journal in cultural theory, in media theory. And again, this is just our way of trying to explore some of these. For us, yes, we can write books, and that's really, really important to kind of books. I'm not saying that we should move away from that. The books have been very important in communicating knowledge, sharing knowledge, helping you to work out, as we had with that quote from Wittgenstein. But we want to explore these new ways of doing that. So, Culture Machine's about 16, 17 years old now. So it's just it's an academic journal, but we also realised that if we want to explore some of this new media and what it can do, we were probably going to have to create our own space to do that, because other people weren't really ready to explore with that. So in the first issue, I don't think you can even find it online now, there was already a kind of interactive hypertext. That was the first thing we published in there, and a collective thing. So trying to very much explore some of these new forms. When we started it, we did think, there'll be all these other people out there that really want to kind of do this as well. And to be honest, there wasn't that many. We had to do them, which is where it's led to a lot of the other projects. Having said that, we did feel that Culture Machine was due for a change. It felt like it was falling into repetition. For us, we wanted it to take some new directions. So one of the things we're really excited about is that we've moved it, the editorial role of that, we've now moved it to a young scholar in Mexico, because we felt that the work that we were doing was really interesting, the work that we were publishing that was interesting, but it was within certain very much confines of UK, US, Australia, and that in itself can become some sort of it just became kind of repetition without difference. It was for us, it was losing some of that kind of spark, that excitement. So we wanted to try to get some of that back by taking it in a very different direction. Try to break down that we didn't just move it to Mexico because Mexico is somehow the other, and it will be very different. But what will happen to something like Culture Machine? What happens to theory if it's done, or if it's directed from a very different context? So that's why we've moved the editorship to Mexico. One of Culture Machine's sister projects is Photomediation's Machine, and what we're doing with that is we're trying to explore what, if you like, an academic journal would look like if it wasn't text-led, if it wasn't led by written essays. What we want to explore, just as with the Liquid Theory TV, we were exploring how we can use video to create and disseminate theory. How can we use photography? How can we have an image-led academic journal and a theory journal, something that is just as rigorous and, as if you like, is philosophical, but it's led by images and photography rather than the text. So the photo mediations machine ties in with our trying to explore this, if you like, post-Gutenberg galaxy, as we've been talking about it. Can we use these different media if it's not just going to be literate or literacy based, if it's going to be more visual or sound or moving image or the still image. But we also want to explore that notion, you know, that generally images are seen associated with the spectacle. It's kind of coming from, you know, Guy Debord or the Jean Baudrillard. It's kind of, look, this is spectacle. It stops us thinking. What we want to explore is, can we think with the image? Can we explore rigorously philosophical ideas, theoretical ideas, our notions of society and community and communication, and what it is we're doing when we're thinking about culture and the media? But can we do that using the image rather than us just being kind of, if you like, the passive victims of this spectacle that stops thought? Another project would be the Centre for Disruptive Media. It's based at Coventry University, and that is an experiment to what can we do with the university, what can we do inside the university. Disruption is a concept that's been associated primarily with business and management studies. So from that point of view, a disruptive technology would be a technology that disrupts one market and by generating a new market. So the famous example, and since we're using digital cameras, we should use this one, I suppose, although it's almost a cliche now, is Kodak film. And so Kodak's engineers at some point in the 80s came up with them and said, you know, we've got these new things called digital cameras. They're going to be really the future. You should really get into this. And obviously Kodak had 90% of the analog film market, and they said, why would we actually ever do this? It would be just taking away from market. Why would we waste our time? And so they didn't, and obviously Kodak in 2012 went out of business because they were taken over by digital cameras, by mobile phones. So disruptive technology is the one that kind of really disrupts that kind of market. So we wanted to be working within those kind of notions, if you like, but we also want to be disrupting that very notion of business, of the university needs to operate as a business, be part of a market. Can we use that to explore other economies, if you like, other ways of working, ways of understanding within the university? So we kind of set up this centre precisely to make it possible for us to do that. Can the university today operate neither as a business, which is where we're concretely getting pushed, but neither flipping back into one of its past forms? So too often when people are complaining about the humanities not being privileged or undergoing a hard time in the university, they seem to want to get back to some previous notion of the humanities, which for us would be just as problematic. We're not going to go back to the F.R. Leavis, a few people sitting in a small office reading the classic texts. I mean that either that gentlemanly, the gentlemanly amateur almost notion of what universities does, or even that more 60s institutionalized notion. Neither of them seem something that we can kind of resort to or very, very helpful. But neither do we want to, and this is how we're all being forced, neither do we want to be turning into the kind of entrepreneurs that we're all being encouraged to act as now, which is kind of, so we do use Twitter and Facebook. We do have a library and the guys with the Disruptive Media Learning Lab at Coventry, they have the top floor of the library. It does look a little bit like Google. They kind of have talked about, sometimes they think of themselves as almost acting as freelancers, and that's almost how we're being encouraged to act within universities, almost as freelancers, thinking of, we're running almost our own businesses within these spaces. What we're interested in is, well, can we have neither of those options? So we're not the entrepreneurial freelance model that we're encouraged to work to, but neither do we want to hark back to some more traditional notion of what is to work inside a university. Can we use this moment of transition again to do something that we're really excited about and that we believe in, rather than being kind of swept away with this this push towards businessification, this kind of managerialism? Can we twist this and usurp this to our own end? And another thing we're exploring with the Centre for Disruptive Media is, as part of that, exploring what the university can be in the 21st century. It's really important to us because I work in an art school, so it's where I get the space to do a lot of this crazy stuff. Is what is an art school going to be in the 21st century? There's a lot of pressure with discourses of impact for us to just serve the economy. This obviously connects to the government's privileging here of STEM, so the sciences, technology, engineering and mathematics, because they're seen as the forces that are going to drive the country into prosperity, so we have to kind of privilege them. What we see is discourses and protocols and technologies from STEM subjects being imposed onto the humanities, so we have to conform to their notions of measurement, of their notions of value, and you see that even in something such as open access, whereas open access is being driven by people in STEM subjects, and that's kind of great, but they still tend to prioritise what's important to people in those subjects. So it's still primarily journal articles, because journal articles are the main criteria by which people are judged in the sciences, by which they publish, whereas in a lot of the humanities it's much more books and it's much more monographs. So open access is far more developed in terms of publishing journal articles and those science metrics, and so we want to create a space where we can still have spaces for the arts and humanities. One alternative that we've discussed is changing STEM into STEAM, and you just have the arts kind of included in there. My problem with that is that STEM's still kind of dominant. You've just got a little bit room for the arts. Kind of, you're going to have A in there along with the S and the T and the E and the M, and it's just kind of really small, and it feels like we want to play by your rules, but just include us a little bit. What we're interested in is just questioning the rules and creating a different space for working out what an art school can be in the 21st century. Again, it can't go back to something in a previous era. You can't try and resurrect the Bauhaus or something that happened in the 60s, although they sound really fantastic, even if a lot of people might be spending a lot of time down the pub. But can we still do something really exciting in an art school that isn't falling into any of those kind of patterns? It isn't just isn't passively adhering to this entrepreneurialism, this emphasis on impact, this privileging of STEM and its discourses and protocols. So when I'm talking about performing these kind of roles and exploring and experimenting with, I'm not talking about going back into something more serious and more studious, if you like. Although that was a lot of my training. That's the kind of tradition you're brought up with. So it's not going back to that, if you like, continental philosophy tradition. That notion of that kind of an intellectual that you could say comes almost from the French Revolution, and their emphasis on freedom and liberty and fraternity, whereas opposed to in the UK we have a much more gentlemanly amateur scholar version of the intellectual. We're kind of allergic to that more continental, more political, as we see it, to version, Intellectual here is almost a dirty word, and the only way it's been rehabilitated lately is this notion of the public intellectual. Although for me that is a kind of a contradiction, because as Sartre defined it, I mean, the intellectual by definition is someone with an expertise in a certain sphere, but then is able to communicate that outside of that sphere into a broader environment. So the intellectual is almost by definition already public. But here again, it's seen as, we're not going to talk in a specialised language. We're going to communicate to the everyday person, whoever that is, since we're all kind of everyday people. And then you get into that role that kind of somebody like Zizek occupies, that kind of space where you're funny and you tell jokes and you're kind of a little bit eccentric, and he gets away with it in the UK because he's not English and he's not British, and so we can allow him that kind of eccentricity, if you like. But again, for me, I'm kind of uncomfortable. Do we have to? If we're going to use some of this medium, and Zizek's great, and he uses the films and he uses the TV, but we have to almost turn ourselves into personalities. We almost have to become kind of intellectual celebrities. Is that the only choices we have? Or can we find some spaces for exploring different and using these media in different ways?